"Then I shall not take the pretty one," Jasper, Duke of Holloway, said, his gaze fixed past Edwina Norwood's rubies and onto Grace Marsden's cracked ivory fan. Anthony Norwood's smile froze. For one breath, the Brighton ballroom seemed to forget its own rules. The dancers slowed. A footman stood motionless beside the punch table. A lady near the candles stopped, with her fan half open. Her mouth parted in the shape of a whisper she did not dare finish. Grace Marsden stood half-hidden near the curtains, exactly where her stepfather had placed her. Not beside Edwina, not near the chandeliers, not where a gentleman looking for a wife might notice her. At the edge. She did not blush, she did not step forward, and she did not mistake a duke's attention for rescue. Powerful men had used her name before. They had borrowed her silence, her labor, her obedience, and called it family duty. So Grace only gripped her mother's old ivory fan tighter. The crack in the third rib bit through her glove and into her palm. It was the only sharp thing allowed to her in that house. Before the night ended, the sister they had tried to hide would be the only woman the Duke of Holloway named before them all. But Grace did not know that yet. She only knew that Anthony's trap had failed. And failure in the Norwood house always had a price. Edwina stood frozen in ruby silk, polished and presented like a jewel in a shop window. Her curls had been pinned with pearls. Her gloves were new. Her cheeks were arranged in that tender, helpless expression Anthony had trained her to wear whenever a titled gentleman came near. The entire room had expected Jasper to claim the glittering prize. Instead, his dark, unreadable eyes remained locked on Grace's plain cream muslin. "A dry jest, Your Grace," Anthony managed, his voice tightening beneath the forced laugh. "You have been long away from society. The humor of the camp does not always translate to the ballroom." Jasper did not look at him. "I was not jesting." A small sound passed through the room. Not quite a gasp. Worse than a gasp. The sound people made when they realized a scandal had begun, and they were fortunate enough to be present at its birth. Jasper stepped around Edwina as if she were an obstacle placed in poor taste. The crowd parted for him. Grace felt the weight of 100 eyes turn upon her. It was a physical thing, a hand at the back of her neck, a pressure urging her downward. She locked her knees. She would not shrink. "Miss Marsden," Jasper said. His voice was low, carrying the hard edge of a man accustomed to being obeyed in worse places than drawing rooms. "You will grant me the next set." It was not a question. Grace looked at him. Really looked. He was not a savior painted in gold. He was a war duke, returned from the continent with a shadow behind his eyes and a stillness too dangerous to be mistaken for calm. She had seen him watching Anthony earlier in the evening. It had not been the look of a suitor. It had been the look of a hunter, measuring the distance to a throat. "I am not dressed for the center of the floor, Your Grace," Grace said. Her voice was perfectly even. The words came with the dry edge she used when fear would otherwise show. "I did not ask about your dress." He held out his hand. The silence in the room stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. If Grace took his hand, she humiliated Edwina. If she refused, she insulted a duke and brought Anthony's full rage upon herself the moment the carriages departed. She did not want to be a pawn. But she also refused to cower behind the curtains while they decided her fate. Grace closed the cracked fan with a soft, sharp click. She placed her gloved hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. Warm, heavy, entirely unyielding. He led her to the floor. The music started a beat too late, the musicians scrambling to recover their tempo. As Grace and Jasper turned in the first measure of the country dance, The difference between them felt almost visible. He moved like a man who owned the ground beneath him. She moved like a woman allowed to stand on it only by permission. "You did not wish to dance," Jasper said. He did not smile. "I did not wish to be a spectacle," Grace corrected quietly. She kept her eyes on the line of his lapel. "There is a difference. My stepfather offered you a prize, Your Grace. It is generally considered poor manners to inspect the furniture instead." His jaw tightened. "I do not deal in prizes, and you are not furniture." Grace's fingers closed once around the fan. "I am the dependent older stepsister." She said the words dry from long use. "I manage the household accounts. I mend the linen. I stand near the walls so that Edwina may shine brighter by contrast. That is my function." "Why do you let them place you at the edge?" Grace looked up then. There was no pity in his eyes. She would have hated pity. There was only a cold, unsettling attention, as if he had found a line in a ledger that did not balance and meant to understand why. "A woman who has been placed often enough learns where the walls are," she said softly. "It saves the trouble of bruising herself against them." Jasper's step hitched, only a fraction of a second. Then he caught the rhythm again. He almost smiled, then did not. He looked at her not as a woman to be pitied or pursued, but as a soldier might look at another survivor across a battlefield neither wished to name. The music ended. He bowed, she curtsied. Then he walked away. Grace thought the danger had passed. It had only changed its name. The next morning, the Norwood townhouse was a hive of hushed panic. Anthony paced the length of the breakfast room, his boots striking the floorboards like hammer blows. Edwina sat near the window, crying delicate, practiced tears into a lace handkerchief. Grace sat at the small writing desk in the corner, quietly checking the baker's tallies. She did not speak. Speaking only drew fire. "He is playing a game," Anthony spat, turning on his heel. "The Duke of Holloway does not court spinsters in mended muslin. He is testing my pride. He wishes to see whether I will lower Edwina's portion." "He looked right past me," Edwina whispered. "Everyone saw it. Lady Jersey laughed behind her fan. I am ruined." "You are not ruined," Anthony snapped. His gaze turned to Grace. All warmth vanished from his face, replaced by the cold calculation he usually reserved for accounts overdue. "You will fix this." Grace did not look up from the ledger. "How, precisely, am I to dictate the actions of a duke?" "You will be agreeable." Anthony stepped closer, casting a shadow over her small desk. "If he calls, you will sit with him. You will be dull. You will be polite. You will answer in monosyllables until he tires of his own jest. And you will not, under any circumstances, make Edwina look a fool again." Grace pressed the nib of her pen against the blotter. The ink spread into a black star. She was trapped. Not chosen. Not wanted. Merely lifted like a shield, so Anthony might protect the daughter he actually prized. The knocker sounded at the front door. Every face in the breakfast room turned. A moment later, the butler announced the Duke of Holloway. Jasper entered with the same grim precision he had shown at the ball. He wore a dark riding coat that smelled faintly of sea wind and leather. He did not bring flowers. He did not bring apologies. He barely looked at Edwina, who had instantly straightened her spine and arranged her profile toward the light. He looked at Grace. "Miss Marsden," he said, "I am walking to the circulating library. You will accompany me." Anthony opened his mouth. then closed it. He forced a wide, terrible smile. Of course, Grace would be delighted. Edwina, my dear, perhaps you should go as well. The sea air is good for the complexion. Jasper's eyes cut to him. Miss Norwood may walk where she pleases. Mrs. Lyle may follow at a proper distance. I asked Miss Marsden. It was not improper enough to challenge. That made it worse. Grace saw the blood rise into Anthony's face, but her stepfather swallowed the insult. He needed the Duke too much. She stood. She did not look at Edwina. She took her pelisse, her bonnet, and the cracked ivory fan, then followed Jasper out into the pale Brighton morning. The wind off the sea was sharp. It tugged at the ribbons of Grace's bonnet and flattened her muslin skirts against her legs. Behind them, Edwina and Mrs. Lyle followed, with all the offended dignity of unwilling chaperonage. Jasper matched his long stride to Grace's. He did not offer his arm. Somehow that made the walk easier. For 3 blocks, they said nothing. Then Jasper spoke without looking at her. You hold that fan as though it were a weapon. Grace looked down at her gloved hands. She loosened her grip a little. It was my mother's. It is broken. It was broken the night my stepfather first called me difficult in front of company. The truth left her before she could make it prettier. I closed it too sharply. The ivory gave way. Jasper stopped. Grace stopped with him. The wind caught his dark hair, disturbing the severity of him for a moment. He did not offer easy sympathy. He did not say he was sorry. Men who said they were sorry often expected gratitude for the sound. He simply looked at the fan, then at her hand. You kept it. It is a useful reminder, Grace said. Pressure applied to fragile things usually breaks them. His gaze returned to her face. He understood. She saw it, and the understanding unsettled her more than pity would have done. He knew she was not speaking only of the fan. She was speaking of herself, of Edwina, of the whole polished, suffocating house Anthony had built out of other people's usefulness. They reached the circulating library. Edwina drifted toward the fashion plates, at once eager to be seen by the fashionable loungers near the bow window. Mrs. Lyle stationed herself beside a display of new novels and watched with the rigid concentration of a woman determined not to be blamed for anything. Grace moved toward the back shelves. Her gloved fingers passed over sermons, travel accounts, and the heavy, practical volumes no one expected young ladies to want. Jasper stood beside her. He did not crowd her, but his presence blocked the rest of the room. You read treatises on architecture, he said, looking at the volume she had drawn halfway from the shelf. I read about structures, Grace corrected. She slid the book back into place. How things are built, how they are held up. Her hand remained on the spine. She should stop. She knew that. A woman in her position survived by keeping her wants small, tidy, and invisible. Yet he was listening, not waiting for her to be finished. Listening. I keep an account, she said. A small fund. From my mother's annuity. For a dowry. The question was flat. Grace looked at him sharply. No. The old thorns rose at once. For a room. A reading room down near the dressmakers' shops. A place where the girls may come when their work is done. Where they may sit by a fire and learn their letters. Where warmth is not something they owe a man for afterward. The last sentence came too quickly. She stopped. Her heart beat hard against her stays. She had never spoken the dream aloud. Not fully. It felt almost indecent to want something so fiercely. She waited for him to laugh. Or worse, to soften into that indulgent look gentlemen wore when a woman's mind inconvenienced them. Jasper did not laugh. He reached out not toward her hand, but toward the fan she held against her chest. His gloved fingers touched only the cracked edge. "What is the rent on such a room?" Grace exhaled. He had not offered to buy it for her. He had asked a practical question. He treated the dream as if it had weight. £4 a quarter, she said. You will need coal. I have accounted for coal. And better locks. Those lanes are not safe after dark. I have accounted for the locks as well. A faint line appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not quite amusement. Not quite admiration. Of course you have. It was the first warmth he had allowed her to see. Small. Contained. Gone almost at once. But as they walked back to the Norwood house, he came half an inch closer than before. Not enough for anyone to remark upon. Enough for Grace to notice. He had seen the want she kept hidden, and he had not used it against her. That was the first dangerous kindness. 2 nights later, Anthony staged a small, suffocating supper party. The purpose was obvious. He meant to force Jasper and Edwina into a confined space until the Duke finally remembered which sister he was supposed to admire. Grace was seated near the bottom of the table, beside Mr. Lionel Harcourt, a man whose chief occupations were collecting gossip, spending other men's wine, and laughing at whatever cruelty seemed safest. Jasper was placed in the seat of honor, directly across from Edwina. But Jasper did not look at Edwina. He watched Grace. He watched the way she ate almost nothing. He watched the way her hand rested near the stem of her glass, fingers tense, but still. He watched Anthony watch him watching her. Lionel, emboldened by port, leaned toward Grace. His voice was loud enough to carry. I hear you have been wandering the bookshops, Miss Marsden. Looking for tracts, they say. Planning to open a little charity room for street girls. How very noble. And how very convenient for a woman whom no man has yet claimed. One must have an occupation when the dance card is empty, I suppose. Edwina gave a small laugh behind her napkin. Anthony did not stop the insult. It served his purpose to remind the room of Grace's value. At the head of the table, Jasper's hand tightened around his glass. Grace saw the knuckles whiten. He opened his mouth. She spoke first. She did not raise her voice. She set down her fork with a small, precise click, and turned to Lionel with an expression so calm it made his smirk falter. A room where a girl may read, Mr. Harcourt, is less foolish than a room where men congratulate one another for choosing her, she said. I prefer the company of women trying to improve their minds to the company of men trying to prove their consequence. The silence that followed was absolute. Lionel's face darkened. Edwina stared. Anthony's mouth opened as if he had been struck. Jasper sat back slowly. The glass in his hand remained whole, but something in his expression changed. The cold did not vanish. It cracked. Behind it was not softness exactly, but pain made quiet by long discipline. He looked at Grace as if he had finally understood the nature of her pride. It was not vanity. It was the last clean garment she owned. She had defended herself without tears, without begging, without turning to him for rescue. He had never seen anything more magnificent. After supper, the gentlemen lingered over port. Grace withdrew to the music room, where only one candelabra had been lit. She sat at a small table near the pianoforte, pulled her ledger from her reticule, and used the cracked fan to hold the pages open. Her hand shook once. She pressed it flat. The confrontation had felt clean in the moment. Now dread settled into the empty room with her. Anthony would punish her when the guests left. He always did. Not with blows, Anthony preferred more useful cruelties. A bill withheld, a maid dismissed, a letter never posted, a room made colder. A shadow fell across the ledger. Grace looked up. Jasper stood in the doorway. He did not close the door fully. He left it open by several inches, enough for the corridor lamps and the distant movement of servants to keep the room respectable. Still, the air changed when he entered. "You should not have provoked Harcourt," he said quietly. Grace looked back at the columns of numbers. "I did not provoke him. I answered him. There is a difference. Norwood will punish you for it. He punishes me regardless." She looked up then. "Why are you here, Your Grace?" Jasper did not answer at once. His gaze lowered to the ledger. He saw the small sums, the careful columns, the pennies built into a future. Then he saw the cracked fan holding the page open. "My cousin," he said suddenly. "Thomas." Grace went still. She did not interrupt. "He was 19. Jasper continued, his voice stripped of command. "He marched with my regiment in Spain. He died of the fever. Half the men were half dead before the French ever saw them. Their boots dissolved in the winter mud. Their tents split in the rain. Men froze under canvas a merchant would not have used to cover a cart." Grace's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Jasper stared at the candle flame. "A man in London signed the contracts, took government money for sound leather and good canvas, then supplied rot and kept the difference." He looked at her. The name on those contracts was Anthony Norwood. The room became very quiet. Grace could hear the clock on the mantel, the faint clink of glass from the dining room, the sea wind at the shutters. "I came to Brighton to ruin him," Jasper said. "I came to find the proof he keeps in this house. I came to watch him answer for every man he sold." Grace looked down at her ledger. The numbers blurred. The fan, the accounts, her knowledge of Anthony's habits. She understood at once. He had not looked at her in the ballroom because he saw her. Not at first. He had looked because she was the weak point in Anthony's defenses. The dependent. The overlooked daughter. The woman who managed the household books and might know which drawer held which key. "I see," Grace said. Her voice was terribly calm. "I was convenient." Jasper stepped closer. "It began that way. The honesty hurt more than a lie would have done. But it is not that way now," he said. "Is it not?" Grace pulled the ledger toward herself and removed the fan from the page. "You are using my family's ruin as a social game, Your Grace, and you expected me to be grateful for the attention." Grace. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded almost like a plea. "Do not," she said. She stood. She did not hurry. She would not give him that victory either. She walked to the door with perfect, painful dignity. "You came for justice. Secure it. But do not use me to hide your war." She left him standing in the candlelight. Jasper did not follow. That was the second dangerous kindness. The next morning, rain lashed against the windows of the closed breakfast room. Grace stood by the unlit hearth, her arms wrapped around herself. She had not slept. She had spent the night staring at the ceiling, while the truth arranged itself into a shape she could not escape. If Jasper ruined Anthony, the scandal would not strike Anthony alone. It would strike the house, Edwina, the servants, Grace's mother's annuity, which Anthony had folded through his accounts until disentangling it would take a lawyer she could not afford. The reading room would die before the fire had ever been lit. The door opened. Jasper walked in. He looked as though he had not slept either. Grace turned to face him. She held the cracked fan closed in one hand. "You call it justice because revenge sounds less lonely," she said. The words were not cruel. They were worse. They were accurate. Jasper stopped. For a moment he looked as if she had struck him. Then the breath left his lungs. The cold authority that usually held him upright seemed to give way under its own weight. He was not, in that moment, the Duke of Holloway, not a soldier, not a man built of rank and command. He was simply a man who missed his cousin and had mistaken anger for a place to put grief. He walked toward her slowly. Grace did not retreat. He stopped with a careful distance still between them. "And you call it dignity," his voice rough, "because wanting still frightens you." Grace closed her eyes. There it was, the thing she hated him for seeing. The long hunger beneath the silence, the exhaustion beneath the straight spine. The girl who had once wanted to be chosen, then taught herself to call that wish childish because no one had chosen her. "I have never wanted to take Edwina's place," she whispered. Her voice broke on the name. She opened her eyes. "I never wanted to be the prize. I only wanted one place. Just one place that was mine first. Not left over. Mine." Jasper lifted his hand. He did not take her. He did not pull her into an embrace she had not granted. He touched his knuckles lightly to her cheek, a gesture so restrained that it hurt more than a kiss might have done. "You are not left over, Grace," he said. "You have never been." Something in her chest loosened, and it frightened her. The air between them changed, not softened, not solved. Changed. Beyond that room, the next public trap was already being laid. The Assembly Room's subscription ball was 3 nights away. Anthony meant to announce loudly and falsely that Edwina and the Duke had reached an understanding. He would try to force Jasper under the eyes of the town. And Jasper's solicitor, Mr. Hugh Wadham, had arrived in Brighton with the last proof needed to expose the contracts. The deadline had found them both. Anthony Norwood was not a fool. By the afternoon before the Assembly ball, he had seen enough. The Duke had not been diverted by Grace. He had been drawn nearer. So Anthony struck with the weapon he understood best: society. He sent Lionel Harcourt into drawing rooms, card rooms, and milliners' shops with a smile and a poisoned whisper. By evening, the story had spread. Miss Marsden had trapped the Duke of Holloway. Miss Marsden, bitter and fading, had used her pitiful circumstances to catch his sympathy. Miss Marsden had stolen her younger sister's chance. A shameless, grasping spinster. The words reached Grace before dinner. Edwina brought them herself. She burst into Grace's small bedroom with her face blotched from tears and humiliation. "They are laughing at me," she sobbed, pointing a trembling finger. "Because of you. You could not bear being unseen, so you took the only man who looked. You stole him." The accusation struck the exact center of Grace's wound. Stole. Even when someone chose her, they called it theft. Grace did not argue. She did not defend herself. The old survival instinct took over before thought could catch it. She walked to her small trunk and opened it. She placed the ledger inside. Then 2 woolen dresses. Then the packet of coins hidden beneath her stockings. She would disappear. She would take the morning coach to London. She would abandon the reading room, abandon the ball, abandon the whole bright, cruel room of them. If she were not there could be no stolen sister, no scandal, no choice Anthony could twist into shame. She carried her travelling bag down to the side entrance after the household had quieted. The hallway was dark. Jasper stepped out of the shadows. Grace stopped. He looked at the bag, then at her pale, set face. His chest rose and fell once sharply. She saw the instinct in him, the old command, the War Duke's urge to bar the door, order the carriage back, wrap her in his title, and burn anyone who had driven her there. He took one step forward. Grace's grip tightened on the handle of the bag. He saw it. He saw the terror in her eyes. Not terror of him, exactly. Terror of being kept. Of being told once again that someone else knew best where she belonged. Jasper stopped. That stopping cost him. She could see it in the rigid line of his shoulders. "You are leaving," he said. "I am removing the problem." Her voice shook despite her efforts. "If I am not here, there is no stolen sister, no scandal. You may ruin Anthony without ruining me in the process." For a long moment he said nothing. He wanted her. Grace could feel that wanting in the air between them, fierce and restrained, and almost painful. But he stepped aside. He cleared the path to the door. "Leave if you choose," Jasper said, his voice raw. "But do not leave because they chose shame for you. If you walk out that door, Grace, do it because you want the road, not because you are afraid of the room." He did not touch her. He did not order. He gave her the one thing no one in that house had ever given her: the terror of her own choice. Grace looked at the door, then at the dark street beyond it, then at the man who stood entirely still, letting her go. She looked down at the fan in her hand. The crack in the ivory caught the weak lamplight. Pressure broke fragile things. But the fan had not been thrown away. Grace turned from the door. Without a word, she carried her bag back up the stairs. Jasper remained below until she was gone. That was the third dangerous kindness. By morning, it had become something else: trust. The Brighton assembly rooms blazed with chandeliers, silk candle smoke, and overheated perfume. The entire town had gathered for the spectacle. Anthony Norwood stood near the center of the room, his chest lifted, his smile polished to a hard shine. Edwina trembled slightly at his side, in pale blue satin. Lionel Harcourt hovered nearby, eager as a carrion bird. Anthony was waiting for the Duke to arrive, so he could make his loud, presumptive toast and trap Jasper beneath the gaze of the room. Grace stood near the edge. She wore the same cream muslin. She held the cracked ivory fan. But she did not lean against the wall. She stood straight. The double doors opened. Jasper, Duke of Holloway, entered. He wore severe black evening dress. His face was pale and controlled, his eyes fixed ahead. He did not scan the room. He did not allow the whispering crowd to pull him left or right. He walked directly toward Anthony. Anthony's smile stretched until it looked painful. "Your Grace!" he boomed, raising his voice so every person in the room might hear. "You honor us. Edwina has been saving the first dance. We were just speaking of the settled nature of our family's friendship." Lionel gave a sharp laugh from the side. "Or the unsettling nature of certain other friendships." Jasper stopped. He did not look at Edwina. He looked at Anthony. "We are not friends, Norwood." His voice was not loud. but it cut through the violins like a blade. "And I have no arrangement with your daughter." The room gasped. Anthony's face drained of colour. "Your Grace, the understanding—" "There is no understanding," Jasper said. "There is only a man who built his fortune on the rotting boots of dead soldiers, attempting to sell his daughter to purchase safety." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the musicians faltered. Jasper had the room. He had Anthony. He could have finished the strike then, named every contract, called Mr. Wadham forward, turned the entire assembly into a court of whispers. He had come to Brighton for that exact moment. Then he looked toward the edge of the room. He saw Grace. The woman Anthony would make collateral. The woman society would call ambitious if she stood ungrateful, if she fled, shameless if she accepted, bitter if she refused. Jasper turned his back on Anthony Norwood. A sharper gasp passed through the room. He walked across the open floor. The crowd parted before him. He stopped in front of Grace Marsden. Every whisper died. Jasper did not fall to his knee. He did not offer a theatrical rescue. He stood before her, with his vengeance unfinished behind him and his consequence exposed before the whole town. "Miss Marsden," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room, "I have no right to ask anything of you, but I ask your permission to stand beside you." Grace felt the eyes of the room burn against her skin. Anthony's panic, Edwina's shock, Lionel's hungry attention. For 27 years she had been useful. The quiet one, the plain one, the one who made the household run and took no credit because credit belonged to prettier faces. She had been placed at the edge so often that the edge had begun to feel like part of her body. Now the whole room waited to see whether she would be grateful. Grace stepped forward. She moved away from the wall. She lifted her hand. For a moment the old habit tugged at her. Open the fan, hide the face, survive the room. Instead, she closed the cracked ivory sticks with a sharp, definitive click. She let everyone see her. "I will not be chosen as a weapon against my stepfather, Your Grace," she said. Her voice rang clear. "I will not be chosen as charity to spite those who ignored me. And I will not be the prize you stole from my sister." Jasper held her gaze. "You are none of those things." "If you choose me," Grace said, her chin lifting, "you must choose me as Grace Marsden, not as the sister they rejected, not as proof against him, not as proof of your honor. Just Grace." For the first time that evening, Jasper's expression changed. The cold command left his face. In its place came something quieter, more dangerous, more true. "I choose Grace," he said. "Only Grace. Before the whole world." He offered his hand. Grace looked at it. She did not take it because she needed saving. She took it because she wanted him. She placed her hand in his. Jasper drew her forward into the center of the light. They did not dance. They did not need to. The statement had already been made. The edge of the room no longer held her. The asymmetry was gone. They stood together, while the social power of Anthony Norwood began quietly and completely to collapse. Then Grace turned her head. Her gaze found Anthony. "And my mother's annuity," she said, clear enough for those nearest to hear, "will be separated from your accounts by Mr. Wadham before any public proceeding touches them. You will not spend one more penny of what was never yours." Anthony stared at her. For once, he had no answer ready. Beside him, Edwina stepped back as if the floor had shifted beneath her. Her lace fan slipped from her fingers and struck the boards with a small, naked sound. For the first time in her life, Grace thought Edwina understood what it meant to be left standing in another woman's shadow. Grace opened the cracked fan. Not to hide, to breathe. Anthony Norwood's ruin did not happen with a shout. It happened in the quiet, lethal offices of Mr. Hugh Wadham. The contracts were exposed. The false invoices were matched to the army accounts. The creditors, suddenly courageous, called in what they were owed. Anthony fought at first. He raged in Wadham's office until the clerk went white around the mouth. He called the figures slander. The witnesses bought the Duke a grieving madman with too much influence and too little restraint. Then, Mr. Wadham laid the final schedule of household accounts before him. Anthony stared at it. The hand was small, neat, and mercilessly exact. Grace Marsden had copied every figure from the ledgers he had forced her to keep, every false transfer, every coin moved from her mother's annuity, every payment hidden beneath a servant's name or a coal bill. At the bottom stood her signature, Grace A. Marsden. Anthony's fingers shook once on the edge of the paper. Not because the Duke had beaten him, because the girl he had made invisible had learned every lock in the prison he built, and had kept the key in her own handwriting. Men who had praised Anthony's dinners began forgetting his name. The Norwoods retreated from Brighton before winter. Edwina was not destroyed. Grace had insisted on that. She was vain, Grace told Jasper when he would have pressed further. She was cruel because she was taught it kept her safe. That is not the same as being him. So Jasper pursued Anthony's business affairs, not Edwina's future. Edwina would have to learn to live without a room arranged around her beauty. But she would live. Grace remained in Brighton. She did not move at once into a ducal estate. She took a small, clean set of rooms near the lanes, with a sound lock, a good grate, and 2 windows that looked toward the sea, if one stood on the chair and leaned a little. On the day she moved, the Holloway carriage waited at the end of the lane. It did not stop before her door. It did not deliver trunks she had not bought, or servants she had not hired. It simply stood there, dark and quiet, its crest turned toward the street, while 2 men who had been watching the house from the corner thought better of coming closer. Grace saw it from the upper window. Jasper did not come in until she sent for him. The courtship was public, but quiet. Jasper visited every day. They walked by the sea, with a proper companion trailing far enough behind to preserve both propriety and mercy. They sat in the small, rented room, while chairs arrived one by one, then slates, then a shelf of worn books from the circulating library's discarded stock. He did not buy the reading room for her. Grace signed the lease with her own hand. But he sat beside the fire she had paid for, repaired a broken latch without announcing it, and listened while she argued over whether girls who came in after dark ought to be given bread as well as letters. "You have accounted for the bread?" he asked one evening. Grace looked up from her ledger. "Naturally." This time Jasper did smile. It changed his face so completely that Grace had to look back down before he saw what it did to her. They were married in late autumn. Not at St. George's before a crushing crowd of fashionable witnesses, but in a modest Brighton chapel with whitewashed walls and a wind that rattled the door. Mr. Wadham stood as witness. Mrs. Lyle wept into a handkerchief. A few local acquaintances attended, because Grace had helped their daughters read their first sentences. Outside the church doors stood the first 10 girls enrolled in the Marsden reading room, each holding a small bunch of late heather tied with thread. Grace wore pale blue silk. She wore no heavy jewels, but she carried her mother's fan. Jasper had sent it to a London japanner skilled in delicate work. The broken rib had not been hidden or replaced. The crack had been mended with a fine line of gold lacquer, so that the damage remained visible, bright and strong. The break had not been erased. It had been honored. On the chapel steps, the cold sea wind caught the edge of Grace's veil. Jasper looked down at her, and the old coldness was gone from his eyes. Not because grief had vanished, not because the war had never happened, but because he no longer needed to make ice of every wound in order to survive it. "Are you afraid of the room now, Your Grace?" he murmured. A private echo, a door at midnight, a choice given back. Grace opened the fan. The gold crack caught the autumn sunlight. She was no longer a woman standing at the edge of a ballroom waiting to be overlooked. She was a woman who had built her own place and invited him in. "No," Grace said, sliding her arm through his. "I know exactly where I stand."